Thank you very much for making the time and coming and attending with us this very important event. It's the last Qahwa and Kalam talk this semester. And we're very glad to be hosting AUC alumni. Ehsan Abushadi graduated in 2015 from the architecture department and minored in Arabic. So one of our own. And Yumna Moussa, who graduated in 2019 as a physicist, and then she defected and did her MA in Islamic art and architecture. Please join me in welcoming them. Both have been working on a very important and timely project in Islamic Cairo. And they've decided to share with us today the details of what they've been doing. It's the details behind the platform Patterns of Cairo. Ehsan is the coordinator of the project, and Yumna is the lead researcher on the project. Many others contributed, many others from the department and from outside of our department. Arab and Islamic civilizations have been part of this monumental endeavor. And so I would like to begin by asking you, how did it all begin and what sparked the idea of Patterns of Cairo?
Thank you. A bit of background about who's implementing the project. So this is implemented by our office, Megawra Built Environment Collective. And we've worked extensively on documenting patterns from historic monuments. We've worked in conservation. And we've also developed in parallel a craft development program where we kind of train the community in creating new designs, etc. And maybe I'm stepping over into your discussion about the gap, but there was like a gap that we needed addressed. So this idea came that, we need a platform that we want to share patterns with. And actually the initial idea came from Dina Hafiz, who's outside of our team. At the time she was the cultural policy officer at the Dutch embassy, and she approached us like, hey, there's this gap and I feel like you're a good match to work on this. And so, we received funding from the Dutch embassy to produce this platform. And so these are some of our craft products that we designed prior to establishing this website. And the project itself started in 2022, so it's been about entering now 4 years almost, where we've been documenting patterns. There's been different components to kind of brainstorming the infrastructure of the website, what kind of content we want to share on the website, how we're going to present this content, etc. And so this would, a typical designer would probably trace patterns, sometimes not knowing really the construction of the grid, not really knowing the tradition or understanding where these patterns come from. So the platform kind of aimed to be a holistic one-stop shop, sort of more or less speaking, but it's open access, where you can get information, vector files or like downloadable files that you can manipulate, the stylistic development of these patterns, where they came from, etc.
So, just a follow-up question. Why patterns? And I see that you've clearly on the website differentiated between patterns and intangible patterns. So there's a visual form and a form that is not visual. Maybe it has to do with the symbolic value of the pattern, how people interact with the pattern, the community around the pattern. So how can you expand more on this point?
Yeah, so initially, like in English, like the word patterns can be very broad, and it can like refer to tangible or like decorative patterns, but also intangible patterns. And we were actually discussing the Arabic name. We weren't sure if we should call it Anmat al-Qahira or Zakharif al-Qahira, but we realized Anmat might be a bit confusing for a lot of people, and Zakharif al-Qahira was more straight to the point. So in a way, sometimes the intangible component gets lost in when like we talk about the project, but the idea was that the decorative patterns which we see on buildings tend to have a very strong link to other intangible patterns, which could be patterns of commerce, of production, of migration. And so we have a section that's dedicated to the decorative patterns and another section that's dedicated to the intangible patterns, which are more like narratives. And regarding the decorative patterns, how did we pick them? You know, because there's a lot of decorative elements. Well, one of the main things about, you know, understanding a pattern is that it should be something that's like a repeatable unit. In some cases, it could be merging and continuous. So for example, with the geometric patterns, and sometimes these repeated units, they might somewhat be finite, but can be arranged in a sequence. And this kind of allowed us to also fine-tune the scope, because within patterns there's a lot of motifs, there's a lot of like different elements, so it would be hard to kind of talk about those individually, but sometimes they can form part of a greater pattern. And in phase one, we're focusing on registered monuments, and phase two, which we're starting right now, we're focusing more on unregistered buildings.
So the process, you've mentioned the vector files in the few minutes ago. So that process, would you share with us more? I mean, if there's more on the gap of that was necessary to be filled, it'd be great to unpack this a bit. And then if you can guide us through and guide everyone here through the process of from when the building is identified, the pattern is then documented photographically, then how does it move from the building into the computer, into the vector files, and how can the users best utilize it? But if there's more to unpack about that gap that needed to be filled, please let's address this first and then move into that process of your work.
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
secret.
There were several gaps, and I think also with as Ehsan was talking about, you know, our own work at Magawra, and also kind of Dina Hafiz and artists that have reached out to us, talking about how it's quite difficult for designers, modern designers, if they want to replicate historic designs, to have references or accessible references. I mean, one of the problems, oops, it's going back. One of the problems, like we showed earlier, is that they need to trace everything by hand or by, you know, line by line. And there weren't, most modern studies right now that deal with patterns tend to focus on particular limited categories, not really the entire kind of genealogy of patterns that exist in the region or in Cairo or Egypt. And so the most authoritative, complete patterns that are also accessible to designers or people beyond the academic realm are still the 19th and 20th century books that were produced by Orientalist scholars. So we see designers continuously using Priest Deven and Owen Jones for references, but you know, these books don't really have any information about the historic context of why these patterns developed, how they developed, and also the relationship between these designs and the evolution of craft practices. And the knowledge base, an accessible knowledge base, was a big gap, especially a knowledge base that is directed to almost all types of specialties, so both or art historians, craftsmen or craftspeople, and designers. So we try to work on that to make it accessible to all of these types of people, and also just the average person who's just curious about designs and their history. And so we try to address misconceptions about names. For instance, with terms like arabesque, we try to unpack these names and talk about how they actually relate to different crafts. Behind me here, we have tawriq. These follow specific principles that a lot of times are only kept within a small group of traditional craftspeople, and they're not So designers don't know about, sometimes art historians also don't know about. There's also, with the mashrabiyya, people kind of use the term mashrabiyya to refer to several types, different types of wood lattices and some crafts. So mashrabiyya is the most known, but something like Abu Janzir behind me or manjour, these are all different types of crafts that are dying because people don't know about them and they're not reflected accurately in these, the more accessible 19th and 20th century sources, and also aren't talked about enough in the modern sources. And yeah, so there are several other patterns that people kind of don't know their names and don't know their origins, but also there's a problem with the ongoing relationship between designers and craftspeople on how to execute designs. It seems a bit more didactic because it's based on this assumption that the craftsperson or the artisan doesn't know design or isn't trained in geometry the way a designer is, the way traditional designer education is in today. And so there's this assumption that they're not creative, they're not capable of creating their own designs. But in reality, historically, we have sources, we have manuscripts and accounts that tell us that these craftspeople have always been their own, creative kind of leads. They don't, sure, they can get guidance from patrons or from architects or designers, but they have their own creative input that might even rival today's artists. And we see this translated when people try to replicate historic designs. So for instance, we have here one of the designers today that's quite famous in replicating geometric patterns. And this pattern is from the Geir Anderson Museum, or Beit el-Kritleya. And so this person assumed that that the craftsperson only relied on the geometry. Unfortunately, you discover that when you just replicate the geometry and assume that this craftsperson only had this, footprint to kind of follow and not input themselves, you end up with something completely different from the original. So, I mean, have a look at this and then compare that with the actual pattern. Yeah, the actual pattern here. You see that the ratios are quite different. The thickness of the lines are very different. And to this moment, actually, our team is struggling to replicate this because the designer or the craftsperson did not only use the geometry, they used something that defies the geometry. And we're not sure what it is. It's very difficult to know about unless, of course, you have craftsmen who are fully trained in this to tell us. We've had other patterns similar to this where the craftsmen told us really what they did and the processes, and we try to unpack that with the stories on the website. But again, because of the dying crafts, not every craft is, not every craftsman can tell us the details behind this. And yeah, so this is what we try to address with the stories on the website, and this is why it's important to have all of these elements together: the vector files, and the analysis of how this pattern came to be, and also the stories of if there are any craft practices that are associated with this that have died or are dying, if there are any techniques that are hidden, and any intangible patterns within the pattern itself. And maybe I'll let Ehsan talk more about the process.
Before we get into the process, I just thought of something, because we're talking about filling the gap. And I think you filled a very important gap, which is basically trying to decolonize our own interaction with these patterns and with Islamic art history in general, by reviving the names of the patterns, which we don't use as much in our research because we're unaware of them. So you're bringing them to the foreground, and you're helping us as Islamic art historians use them in the right context. And by providing the stories behind them and behind the patterns themselves, we are reliving the artisanal community in all its aspects, and not just looking at a geometric pattern, a star polygon. Let's reuse it. And at the same time, it's also helping us understand more rigorous geometry. As you've mentioned, it took time to understand how did he, it's something to draw the star polygon on a piece of paper and something else to actually carve it in wood or in marble. So back to the processes.
I'll just add one point. Actually, part of the website also includes a glossary where we focus on Egyptian terminology for certain aspects or elements that more commonly use, for example, the Turkish name or the Maghribi name. So we're also working on, making a glossary that's specific to the Egyptian craft and the Egyptian knowledge.
Wonderful.
So as part of the process, what Yumna mentioned, we have a lot of different patterns, a lot of different techniques. So we try to diversify as much as possible. Like the database has, in the first phase, 200 patterns. Now we're working on adding another 75. At the end of the day, we're also limited somewhat by scope, resources, timeline, etc. So we try to diversify the materials, wood, stucco, painting, marble, tiles. We try to diversify the technique. So even, within stone you have the pierced stone or carved stone or the joinery wood or carved wood. And, we try to kind of create a representative sample that also includes like very common patterns that you might see, repeated in a lot of different buildings, but also very unique patterns that are kind of a one-off. Try to diversify also in terms of colors. So a lot of people might be interested in like seeing what color schemes might have been used, etc. Unfortunately, we do have a lot of patterns that don't have surviving color. Like we know that stucco would have been colored in many cases. And so we tried to mix and match, creating a field survey where we had different patterns. Sometimes we have variations of different patterns. So sometimes we might choose to go for the earliest example that we know. In cases where we know the craftsperson, we might prioritize a pattern that might have come later, but has a named craftsman, so we can talk about that. If a pattern is executed in a more complicated way or out of the normal tradition, then we might focus on that. And then once we had like the general field survey, we started seeing, okay, which of these patterns we can actually access. So some things, we've worked on the conservation, so we have, documentation up close. There's other buildings that are generally not known to the general public, but, there are ways of accessing them, so we try to document those. And then there's, of course, the more kind of monuments that everybody accesses. And we started working on establishing kind of like a system for how to draw them. What kind of information do we want in these drawings, the visual style, are we going to have the grids, are we going to have the construction? We also started working on the research by initially seeing, okay, what kind of information do we want? What is the tone of these articles? Like part of it was we wanted to access a general audience. So while we are based on like academic references, etc., we don't make it overly complicated because we want the general audience to access it. And everything's bilingual in English and Arabic, so that also Egyptians that don't know how to read English can access this information, particularly crafts person.
Can I ask you if your vocation as a restorer, did it help you with the reconstruction of the patterns that were missing, deteriorated, damaged, were recorded at one point in time and then disappeared? How did this play in you being able to reconstruct the missing parts?
So just to add to something Yumna said previously, as conservators, we do focus a lot on what exists and understanding that there were some patterns that might have had, been executed by a master craftsperson, others by, an apprentice or somebody that was still not reaching their full potential. So in these cases, sometimes we might correct a pattern if we feel that, you know, it's because like they ran out of space or like human error, that sort of thing. But if we feel that it was a very conscientious decision by the artisan, you know, taking a certain artistic liberty to deviate from the traditional geometry, that's when like our stance as conservators like helps us make these decisions. But regarding to the reconstruction, Yumna can talk about that a bit more.
I mean, with what we try to with the patterns, we try our best to. If there are variations that are fully constructed, we choose those. But there are cases where we have patterns that are very interesting, and you know the construction is not there. Something is an example here from Takeyt al-Gulshani, which we are currently conserving, and the general outline of the pattern is visible and is clear, but we're not sure how it continues. You know, does it continue with the same unit and around? What types of flowers are there? And there are examples where we have to extrapolate based on our own experience from conservation, like what we've seen. But sometimes we also just do really extensive research on trying to find variations of this that exist elsewhere in the world. For instance, for Takeyt al-Gulshani, we know there's a very similar panel in the Metropolitan Museum. It's not exactly the same, so if you look at the flower, the center, it's they're not the same, but it's generally a similar composition. So it gave us an idea on how the pattern continues, and so it allowed us to reconstruct. And so yeah, and we try to also point that out in the stories that you know, these fragments or these specific patterns were found as incomplete, and it's possible that they continued in a different way. But this is the typical manner, and sometimes we go back. So our work also includes editing information after we've found it. So sometimes we'd find patterns that are incomplete. We'd assume that they continue a certain way based on the research or based on similar variations, and then with several visits we end up finding that fragment somewhere else, or yeah, so around the same building, but it was placed somewhere else after a restoration or something, and so we fix our own kind of interpretation accordingly. So it's also important to point out that I mean, we're trying our best to keep this as an ongoing project, because it's important to keep it, to keep the research up. We keep finding more information. It's a very understudied kind of subfield of Egypt's and Cairo's history, or visual history in general, and we're trying our best. So Ehsan, well, maybe we'll talk more a little bit about phase 2, and maybe we can also think of further phases to continue. And as we continue more phases, we still continue research on things that we've already done, because I mean there's so much information that you can get out of single patterns. Yes.
I see that because digital humanities, what you're doing is basically using your part of your training as art historians. How do art historians think and function and research to benefit what you're doing, and at the same time be active participants in the digital humanities by keeping this website, it's dynamic, it's alive, it's continuously changing. You go back, you fix things, or you add things, you remove things. The research is continuously updated, which is one of the main advantages of having digital humanities, exactly. So with all of these patterns there, and I would like to move into the users. I'm not sure if you have information yet pertaining to the ratios of researchers to students, to artisans, to artists, graphic designers using the website. Do you have any statistics or information on who is actually using it, and if there are any examples of productions based on the website, any artistic production?
Yes. So some of the very specific details are kind of hard to get, but generally, like from the website traffic, we know that around 22% of users are actually returning users, so they've visited the website more than once. We're also very happy to say that people from all over Egypt have accessed the website, so we have visitors from all governorates except North Sinai and Aswan. And users from around 80 countries. And we just launched last July, so these are kind of the statistics since July of last year. About 40% access the website directly, so basic, because we're promoting it, or somebody shared the link with them, or QR code, etc. Around 28% access it from social media. We do a lot of posting on Instagram and Facebook to kind of promote that, and around 26% from search engines. So those are kind of the statistics that the website is able to produce. We know that there's been over 2,000 file downloads. Not that many people still know that you can download content, so it averages to around 5 downloads per user. We're hoping that the statistic will increase. And back in September, we did 2 webinars, and those gave us a bit of information about the profile of people that access this content. It was more or less evenly divided between designers, researchers, and educators. Whether the educators are university level or high school level, we had a mix, as well as vocational training. And then with regards to designers, we don't really have these statistics, but people reach out to us and they tell us, oh, look at this design I've produced, and this was so useful, and they start sharing things with us, sometimes via social media, sometimes in personal encounters.
So you're preserving heritage and helping people reinterpret it. It's, again, bringing it to the forefront, and at the same time helping us and helping students everywhere understand that you cannot be divorced from the past, whatever form the past comes in.
Yeah, so as part of our outreach initiatives, we did have a design exchange workshop where we invited Egyptian designers and Dutch designers to kind of test the potential of this resource and get other designers excited about engaging and designing with this content. And so they produced a couple of conceptual ideas, which we then ended up prototyping over the following couple of months and culminated in this exhibition. And we had invited designers from different disciplines, so fashion, product design, graphic design, textile design. And it was quite rewarding because you see how some people design differently, they have different processes, but at the end, the core, everything is inspired from the heritage. And this really motivated others to kind of, go ahead and dive and explore how to use this and produce contemporary designs.
You're making it easy for designers to access. It's one thing to go and see them on building, it's another thing to have the website with the appropriate files for them to use right away.
Yeah, and in the downloads button, we actually have 2 sections, the vector files, which are kind of aimed for designer, AutoCAD, Illustrator, but there's another button that's just the JPG and the PDF, and this makes it accessible for even people that don't require, design skills. If you're a researcher and you want to include a drawing in your research paper, you can put that. If you're a craft person that kind of relies on printing and photocopying and just kind of tracing things manually, then that's also available for them. And this kind of accessibility was very important when we were designing the website, so it's actually very user-friendly in both desktop version and mobile version.
Thank you.
Because we've also, in addition to the collaborations with designers, we've also collaborated with craftspeople and shared with them, so tried to test kind of how user-friendly the website also is with the craftspeople, especially those that do traditional crafts that are dying. So we have, I hope this plays, we have a video.
الشغلانه دي بقالي 40 سنه. انا طول عمري شغال تبع نفسي، يعني اشتغلت تبع نفسي وانا عندي بتاع حوالي 8 سنين. وانا طلعت لقيت نفسي فيها، يعني بقت في دمي. المكبس النهارده خلى الصنايعي يموت. بدل ما هطلع انا 100 هو بيطلع 200. فاصبح الان الصنايعي بقى صنايعي الحام، مش صنايعي بقى مثلا يفصل او يجي له حاجه تصميم كده يقعد يفصصها.
So yeah, I mean, he's talking. So a lot of the craftspeople that we've collaborated with talk about how they're the only ones that are interested in. There are very few that are interested in doing things with their hands in the traditional way, and trying to actually, and they actively try to use inspiration from the historic monuments and surroundings. So they actively are actively inspired by what they see within the monuments and their interactions with the monuments, and reinterpret them. But as the craftsman here was saying, that most of the new generation and most of the demands of designers as well, when they try to collaborate with artisans, is that they're not allowing the designer to have this freedom, and also share the knowledge that they have kept or preserved over the years about these patterns. And a lot of them were very happy with the fact that more people are referring to the patterns with their original names. More people want to do crafts that were dying, and they've also benefited from the so the books we've developed kind of like a workbook with drawings from the website that they can use, and we were encouraging them to also use that actively, and even if they're not necessarily very well versed in the digital universe, but they can easily download or have someone download for them the drawings and use them directly on the materials that they're working on.
It's quite inspiring to see all of the inner workings of the world of patterns of Cairo. And so I wanted to ask you my last question about the future. What's the next step? Is it going to be an expansion, a regional expansion? Hopefully. I don't know how long this would take, but maybe expand geographically or conceptually.
So in the phase 2, which we're currently working on, it's focused on unregistered buildings, mainly from the 19th century and up until the 1950s. So part of it is focused on this kind of shift in mentality. So this is where we start to have the architects take a greater role in the decorative element of buildings, and we start also seeing kind of the fusion of influences. So we have the architects that are Egyptian that train abroad and then come back with new concepts. But we also have the kind of very cosmopolitan period where we have different communities coming to Egypt with their own like stylistic influences and developing this kind of new repertoire of patterns, which have some kind of foundation in the Islamic arts, but are something quite different. And as part of this, we're expanding geographically from historic Cairo into the more kind of modern neighborhoods, so like the Zamalek, Abdeen, Garden City, Heliopolis, and that's kind of like our focus right now. Beyond that, it really depends on whether we're able to secure funding or not. But I imagine that, working outside Cairo will be very ambitious and require very many resources, because a lot of it has to do with like, field work and research and yeah. So
it's a lot of work. And for those of us who have used their website, the research that's been put into it is amazing. The stories behind the patterns, behind the people, the biographies, it's not just based in our books and primary sources, it's also based in the community, and the stories they have to tell us. So it's oral history, it's everything really. It's art history, it's anthropology, it's graphic design, it's multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary. It's quite amazing, and to be focused on at the moment bringing into this discussion unregistered buildings. This is very timely, especially since we are at almost a disjunction of anything not registered can disappear overnight. It's fair game. It's unregistered. It's gone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This has been very enlightening for all of us and inspiring especially for the students. I mean, there's so many options working in heritage, regardless of your background, regardless of your major. You can still find a place working in heritage. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's time for questions. Ahmed?
Hello. So I have 3 questions, but you can ignore them if they are not important. First one, يعني, after working for like 3 years or more than 3 years on patterns, this in very close, do you have insights about that it challenging the mainstream concept or idea about Islamic patterns, like they are all geometric or they all have these features? So after working for 3 years in this closeness with this pattern, do you have any insights? Second question is, I witnessed it, how it's hard or the people suffering to convert this pattern to a vector or a design that anyone can use. But again, can you enlighten us how hard this process is? Because some people take it like a guaranteed, because we have this pattern, we can like put it and copy it على طول. But again, I know it's very hard. So do you have any insight about the process itself, how the engineering, the architects converted them to a PDF or a vector or something? Says the question regarding the digital humanities, because it's very hard. Yani, most people working in digital humanities have this problem about the stability of website, because after all, which organization will be will guarantee that the website will be sustained and will be fixed every time, and so yeah.
Okay, so regarding the mainstream, it's kind of hard to like really change mainstream opinion, but the idea is that, you know, by allowing this platform to be an educational space, you know, even if it's just like, you know, the handful of people that come across this website, you know, become better informed, that for us, that's like, you know, already like a big accomplishment. Regarding the steps, it can be quite challenging, especially for patterns which have different carving techniques, because then, you know, how do you show like a bevel carving on a 2D drawing? How do you show like different grooves and like how the lighting, you know, goes into the pattern, etc. So I think you know, the way we draw patterns, it's mainly like a representation of the general design, but we, you know, it's different, you know, from saying that you do a photogrammetry or a 3D scan. You need to think about, you know, this kind of there is some loss of kind of information that takes place from the physical 3D materiality and its transformation into something that's 2D and digital. And this is why we try to make this a space where we have the drawings, but also the photographs, so that you can compare and see, you know, what are the differences in the execution that might not, these little subtleties that might not be visible in the 2D design, but that you can see in the photographs. And the last question, the sustainability. So since we're an organization, you know, we hope to always be able to maintain the website. You know, the domain name is probably the cheapest thing, but, you know, the hosting and just general updates with regards to like browser updates, I think that will be the challenge that we might face in the near future. I hope, you know, that it will be smooth going and we'll be able to find the resources to, you know, cover that.
So I had two questions. So first, thank you so much for the presentation. So I had two questions on reception more. So you expressed the fact that it would be very difficult to expand originally because also of the scale of the work. But I was wondering if on reception you also had maybe people from the region, whether it's relevant, express interest in maybe continuing also kind of collaborations, you know, with like people like maybe like using the same methods on a regional scale. So this was my first question because definitely I think it would be very interesting also on what you said on how sometimes part of the work is also to connect with like other like tiles or other patterns that you find elsewhere. So yeah, I had this question, and the second question was on reception on the work you did with the with artisans, and on the other side was more like designers or like we could say like contemporary like artists. And I was wondering if you felt so mostly from maybe designers and artists, if you felt that this initiative was also maybe pushing them to connect further with the artisans. Like, did you feel like this was like two sides of a different work? So you had this reach on designers and a reach on artisan, or do you feel like it was also making the connection? And because you mentioned in the fact that it's not only geometry and it's also about this interaction. So I was wondering if this happened. If yes or no, and if you, how do you see this in on creating maybe also through the website this collaboration that can reinvent the patterns, but also preserve the techniques, as you mentioned, that are dying in some way. So these were my two questions.
So we did have people approach us that say that they're very inspired to do something similar in their own countries. We don't know yet if they've started to take financial steps towards this or like apply for grants towards this, because at the end of the day it's also like, you know, you need resources. You can't just say like, you know, they're going to volunteer and start doing all this, especially since you need like quite an extensive team with like different focuses. And then regarding the craftsperson and the designer relationship, that's a very good question, because although we would love for the designer to always be involved with the craft person, sometimes it just physically is challenging, because this was a workshop that started in September. So there were some designers that came from Netherlands, they went back to the Netherlands, so they weren't in Egypt. So it was mainly our team that was involved in the prototyping, kind of as a liaison between the designer and the craft person. Other designers were very actively involved in the prototyping process. So it's really like a mix and match. But definitely like some of the craftspersons, you know, they were very receptive to this. It also took us some time to find craftspersons that wanted to work with us, because in some cases, you know, they're, you know, kind of stuck in the commercial cycle where, you know, at the end of the day, they also have their projects, you know, their clients, and they need to submit their deliverables. There's other craftsmen that are not really open to experimenting. So they want to have the final design, and they only agree to do the final design and implement with certain quantities, not really like kind of an experimentation process where we're testing things out and we're really just creating a one-off. So it's really varied.
Thank you for this. There's a wonderful lot of new information on this website, obviously. New information that could lead perhaps towards something that I've been encouraging for decades, someone to work on in Cairo, which is an equivalent for the Arab world of Hans Wolf's book on the traditional crafts of Persia. This is one where he studied all the crafts in the bazaar: metalworking, textiles, plaster, glass, stonework, carpentry, brickwork, architecture, and he discussed the raw materials, the names of them in Persian, the names that the craftsmen use for their patterns, the techniques they use to make all of these, and it's fabulous. But there has not been any equivalent for the Arab world, and the fact that you've mentioned so often that these crafts are disappearing, I think this makes this task even more urgent. So, I mean, this is possibly a book or a PhD subject for someone to write, but it hasn't been done yet. There's a big gap. Please, someone work on it. Thank you.
Thank you for your suggestion.
So I think you've touched upon
sort of the role of language in a sense, also in patterns, when you talked about how the terminology is also important. One of the things that I noticed in the video was that the craftsman referred to himself as a sana'i rather than a hirafi, and I feel like this is something that has been going on for a while now. And when you look at the roots of the words themselves, compare sana'a to hirfa, which is in a sense manufacturing something, compared to the craftsmanship and artisanship, do you feel like this language, how is this terminological difference manifested in the the craft itself, the disappearance of the artisanal quality of it, and the appearance of a more mass-produced or sort of a more superficial application of the craft? Do you feel like this actually is happening across the field? And also there's a question regarding the idea of sort of decentralizing the research. You feel like, for example, you can create some kind of forum on your platform where people can contribute to your research in a sense by, if someone stumbles upon a resource or is able to figure out the geometric sort of puzzle of a certain pattern, do you think that this is something that you could possibly apply, which I think could sort of reduce the burden of the research upon you and the financial burden of the research as well?
Can I answer the second question? Take over first. So with regards to the second question, we initially did want for there to be kind of a community component to the website, but we were somehow like left out of this by the web developer. They kept, saying that this was too complex to implement and it's out of scope and out of budget. And so, ideally that would have been what we would have wanted to do, but we did have like some restrictions regarding that. But it doesn't mean that we're not open to discussion. So a lot of people, interact with us over Instagram. They email us. We've been working quite hard on like building the Instagram community because at the end of the day also it serves as a way for us to identify variations, because people post their holiday pictures, visiting different buildings that maybe we might not never get the chance to visit. And as tourists, some people like will focus on different things that kind of like the more established elements, which are always the ones which are printed in books, etc., etc. And then before just you take over on the question of the craft, maybe like I want to just say something regarding to like our role in conservation. But part of it has to do with certain crafts kind of having become almost disassociated from the craft. So for example, this was a tinsmith or some curry. He traditionally makes Ramadan lanterns, but because a samkari is also, the same term that you use for the car repair guy that works on the iron body of the car, or a normal welder that might, work on, I don't know, like different kind of more technical components related to modern life. I think Yumna can go into a bit more about this, but there's also this kind of disassociation because of how traditional terms are now associated with like different work shops.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this disassociation, but there's also an alienation of the it's what I touched upon when I was talking about this misconception about the craftspeople, that they're not designers. So the term sana or sanai is actually the historic term, right? Because they see themselves as makers, really. And this is how it translates in English. They're makers. And the maker involves the design, involves the execution, involves the problem solving with any issues that come up, and the creativity in the problem solving. Now, the terms that we now have, this separation between the designer and the person who executes. And so they had to invent this, herafi sort of thing. And heraf, it doesn't really appear with, if you look at historic kind of material, on, about craftspeople themselves, speaking of themselves, they always speak and say sana or sana'i. They don't say hirafi because they don't differentiate between what's traditional, and hirafi is more associated with traditional versus the modern. There isn't this differentiation, and this is reflective really, because we call them hirafin, or a lot of people or modern designers call them hirafiyin, to differentiate between kind of the type of work that they do and maybe the more sophisticated work that the designer does. But they always see themselves as that, and they and sometimes they're told to kind of, or they're pushed back against to, oh, you're not as good as a designer, or you're not as good as that, but they still do refer to themselves, as makers. And he also, I mean, he spoke about how now people want you to just use a mold or something and copy or do several copies of the same design. There isn't the space for the designer, for the artisan to create anything. And he's spoken to us, so even outside the film, many of them have spoken to us that they wish that when the clients come or when designers come, they allow them to really show how they can design. And so there's some people at AUC currently in the math and physics departments that are working on this idea of the craftsman's vernacular mathematics. Because if you go and try to take a workshop with them, you learn that they have a very interesting understanding of mathematics that is very, very different from the traditional way we learn about it. And it's not less, it's not because they can't, maybe some of them can't read and write, that they don't have knowledge in math and geometry. They do, and it's more powerful and more, kind of, it's really deeper than the one that we have with traditional education in schools and universities. So yeah, it's sad. These terms reflect this divide, and we're hoping that the project will help kind of.
Yeah, yeah. I'd like to add that what you just said is very profound. A way to help the makers, the traditional, the art molders own that terminology, because I see a lot of positionality in there. They embody the land, they embody the culture. They know deeper, regardless of education, regardless of financial stability. So the more they embody it, you see very authentic Egyptian patterns coming out. And I think there should be a space in online projects where their presence is captured, and that'll add a lot of originality to what you're doing. It's very inspirational. My first question is, what was the source of your inspiration to doing this? It's a lot of work, very detailed. And the second one is, to what extent is the Egyptian contemporary design with the traditional design a distinct school? Okay, a distinct school versus the regional flavor or the global flavor or the Middle Eastern design architecture. If there isn't a distinct school, I think the initiative you put into the online should start putting a distinct school on this, because when I go through Egypt, I see patterns all over. The building, the curtains, everything is a pattern, and it's very deep. So that's my first suggestion. And the second is, therefore, how do the Cairo-based design educator, just like you, just like any other person, teach the ancient Egyptian aesthetics as a history, as a method, or as a branding toolkit, so that it helps impact the generations within the timelines? Because I believe different timelines bring a different unique identity through the patterns, but some or most of them must still be preserved to encourage the flow. So that's what I would like to ask. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe I'll answer the second question and maybe the second half of the first question, the idea of the school and the teaching, and Ehsan can talk more about what started this. Definitely, there is an Egyptian school with how we do patterns, and we try to talk about this on the website with a couple of specific patterns and designs. But this also appears in the names. So sometimes you'd find a pattern that is called differently in Egypt and executed a little differently, even though we have variations that are beyond Egypt, in Syria or in Anatolia, in the Maghreb, and the way the Egyptians executed, there's a certain flavor, right? There's a certain technique that's quite Egyptian. The use of tools also affects, and it was very surprising to me personally to see that there were tools that are rooted in Pharaonic and Coptic practices, so pre-Islamic, even though a lot of the buildings that we chose were Islamic. So there certainly is a school, and it has its own terminology and its own practice. Unfortunately, the learning of that school is really kept within the traditional craftspeople, and very, very few of them. So they're really dying. More of them are because of the lack of work opportunities, or people that want to see these traditional designs and also allow them to be creative and kind of show their expertise in that respect. Fewer and fewer of them are choosing to educate more people or more generations into these traditional crafts, and it's really been kept that way there. So we have of course some schools that still try to kind of decrease this gap, like the Jamil school for traditional art or traditional craft. But again, still the people that or the curriculum that's being taught there is still lacking the enough presence of craftsmen or artisans, and there needs to be more initiative. We're trying to also raise awareness about this need, and maybe more people can also, or maybe in the project itself in the future, we might try to do something related to that. Yeah.
There's also a school set up by the state. I don't remember right now the name, and it's more oriented towards the Sana'iyya, where they teach certain techniques, but it's mainly like teaching technique rather than design, and more like replication of design. And even within like a lot of design programs, like whether in university or like vocational training, etc., they'll teach the styles, so you learn about the different kind of like motifs, etc., but not really like how to design with them. So it's usually like an art history class, and then you have design classes where you're expected to, produce designs which are inspired from that, but they're really like the link that kind of focuses on bridging the two, how to design with this, and learning about it is not very present in a lot of curriculums. And also like there's something that we maybe sometimes overlook, but a large part of like the tradition of craft is based on a mentorship program. So it's not really like a school coming in and teaching a curriculum. It's more about there being young people that want to learn from a master craftsman. And this is also in crisis because a lot of young people, they feel that there isn't enough of a market, that the work is very physically challenging, and they would rather, do office jobs or be tuk-tuk drivers, something that can bring in fast cash, as opposed, to working on something for a very long period of time and getting the reward at the end.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for coming. And I hope you are as inspired as the rest of us are with this project, and I hope you get to use it. Visit the website and dig into the details they offer. Thank you.
One last note, I forgot to bring them up. I brought some postcards. So if anybody would like to take some postcards, I'll put them up in the front. Thank you.
Thank you, Ehsan. Thank you, Ehsan. Thank you, Yumna.